Before I get into it, just a quick reminder. If you like stories like this, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. Now, this happened on one of those still, quiet nights when the whole world seems to just pause. Everything around me had slowed to a calm hush, like even time was catching its breath. The streets were empty, the lights were dim, and it felt like I was the only one still awake. I was curled up on my couch, pretending to read a book, but my mind wasn't in it, not even close. My thoughts kept drifting back to something that had happened earlier that day, something that stuck with me in a way I couldn't shake off. My name's Claire. I'm 48 years old, and I've lived in this same little house most of my life. It belonged to my parents before me, and now it's mine. The neighborhood's quiet, nothing fancy, just a row of modest homes and folks who keep to themselves. It fits me, or at least it always felt like it did. I used to think of myself as pretty simple too. Steady, dependable, nothing out of the ordinary. But life's funny, isn't it? Just when you think you've got everything figured out, it throws something at you that makes you question everything. Thomas, my neighbor, has lived next door for as long as I can remember. We've always been polite, friendly nods, a wave here and there, a quick chat over the fence if we both happen to be outside at the same time. He's older than me, probably in his mid-60s. Always seemed like a private kind of guy. Not cold, just reserved. The kind of man who minds his business. But you get the sense that if you ever really needed him, he'd be there without hesitation. I respected that about him, still do. I never imagined that one of those short, casual chats would turn into something that would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew, about him, about my family, and about myself. It was just a regular evening. I had finished dinner and was cleaning up when I noticed Thomas standing out by the edge of his driveway. He looked like he was trying to decide whether to walk over or not. I don't know why, but I got this feeling, like something was up. So I opened the front door and called out, "Hi, Thomas?" He glanced over, his face kind of hesitant. "Evening," he said, a little unsure. "Mind if I come over for a minute?" "Not at all," I told him, stepping aside. "Come on in." Now, Thomas is not the type to go barging into people's homes, so when he stepped into my cozy living room, looking a bit out of sorts, I was curious. He stood there fidgeting, his eyes bouncing around the room before they finally settled on me. Then he cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something," he said. "Something personal, something I've never really talked about with anyone." That caught my attention. I'd never seen him look so nervous. I tried to make him feel a little more comfortable and said, "Of course, what's going on?" He shifted on his feet, then looked me straight in the eye. "Claire," he began, "you might not believe this, but I've known you a lot longer than you think." I blinked. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, like he was about to lay down something heavy. "I used to live in this house. I lived here before your parents ever did." I stared at him, totally thrown off. "You? You lived here? Before my family bought it?" He nodded slowly. "That's right. I grew up in this very house. Same walls, same floors, everything." My mind was racing. I had always thought this house had been in our family forever. My parents never mentioned anything about who came before them. I was floored. How had I never known this? Thomas must have seen the shock on my face because he went on gently. "I know this might be hard to wrap your head around, but there's a reason I never brought it up. A reason I stayed quiet all these years. Not even your parents knew." He paused for a second, like he was digging deep for what he needed to say next. "You see, Claire," he said softly, "this house wasn't just where I grew up. It meant more to me than that." I leaned in a little. I could feel it. Whatever he was about to say was going to change things. He looked down for a moment, then back at me, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was in love with your mother." It hit me like a ton of bricks. My stomach flipped. What? I had never heard anything even close to this before. My mom had been gone for years, and in all that time, no one had ever mentioned a thing like this. I didn't know what to say, but Thomas wasn't done. She was everything to me, he said, eyes heavy with some sadness I'd never seen in him. Your mother, she was the love of my life, but I never told her. I was too scared, too unsure of myself back then. His words just sat there between us, like something sacred and sad at the same time. And all I could do was sit there, wondering how something so big had stayed hidden for so long. By the time I realized what I had let slip away, it was already gone. Hearing those words from Thomas hit me harder than I expected. A wave of feelings came over me all at once: shock, confusion, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. I sat there just staring at him, trying to process everything. In that moment, he wasn't just the quiet man next door anymore. He was someone with real memories, real feelings, someone carrying the weight of something he never got to say out loud until now. For a long while, I couldn't find the right words. I had always seen Thomas as the polite neighbor, kept his yard neat, waved on his way to get the mail, maybe made small talk about the weather. But now, sitting in front of me was a man who had once loved my mother, loved her deeply by the sound of it. And not only had I never known, no one had. My voice came out soft, like I was trying not to wake something up. I didn't know, I said. I had no idea. Thomas gave a slow nod, his eyes locked on mine, not flinching. I know you didn't, and I wasn't expecting you to, but after all these years living next to each other, it just didn't feel right keeping it to myself anymore. You could see it on his face, the relief of finally saying it, but also the sadness that came with it, like he'd been carrying a heavy load on his back for decades, and now that it was finally off, he wasn't sure what to do with himself. He looked tired, not in a physical sense, but the kind of tired that comes from holding something in for far too long. I felt something shift inside me then, a kind of empathy I hadn't expected. Somehow, without either of us saying much, we shared this quiet moment that felt a little heavier than just neighborly small talk. There was a connection there now, one I didn't fully understand, but I could feel it. I sat in the stillness, the silence settling around us like a blanket. I was trying to make sense of what all of this meant. My mom and Thomas, it was a lot to take in. It was like finding a puzzle piece to a picture I didn't even know was unfinished. And whatever I thought I knew before, that had changed. This new truth, this part of the past that had been hidden from me, it was real, and it mattered. Thomas had opened up in a way most people never do, and he had done it not to get anything from me, but simply because he felt I deserved to know. That meant something. The night had gotten real quiet outside, like even the world was holding its breath. I did not know what would come next between Thomas and me, if this would bring us closer or just become something we quietly carried. But one thing was certain: what we shared in that room would never go away. That moment would stay with me. Right when I thought about speaking again, I noticed Thomas watching me. His eyes had softened, not so guarded anymore, like he was waiting to see how I'd respond. But I didn't say anything. I just gave him a slow nod. That seemed to be enough. We both sat there, not needing to fill the silence. We understood each other in that strange, quiet way where words would only get in the way. It was a stillness, but not an uncomfortable one. It felt like something had changed, like we had both seen something honest in each other. Thomas shifted in his seat, lacing his fingers together, then letting them go again. He was fidgeting, sure, but there was also this calm about him, like he had finally set something down after carrying it too far. I know it's a lot, he said gently, breaking the quiet. And I don't want you to think I brought all this up to make your life harder or anything like that. I felt like you deserved to know, deserved to understand what your mom meant to me. I nodded slowly, my thoughts spinning. The idea of my mother being deeply loved by someone I had always seen as just a neighbor, that was a hard thing to wrap my head around. It was not that I didn't believe in love or appreciate what it meant. It was just this kind of love, one that had gone unsaid, buried for years, living in silence. That was something I had never considered. And hearing it now, it brought up old memories I hadn't visited in a long time. I appreciate you telling me, Thomas, I said, my voice a little shaky. but I don't know what to think yet. I never knew my mom had someone out there who felt that way about her." He looked down at the floor, his eyes full of something like regret. "She never knew, Claire. I never told her. Not in a way that mattered. I always thought I'd get the chance. I figured there'd be time." He paused and looked back up at me, but there wasn't. And the way he said that, like the words had been waiting years to be said, well, it broke something open in me. Because this wasn't just about my mom anymore. This was about love and loss and all the things we never say until it's too late. "That's something I've had to live with," Thomas said, his voice low and full of weight. And as he spoke those words, I swear I could feel the burden he had been carrying, like his regret somehow reached across the space between us and settled into my own chest. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. You could hear the years in his voice, the missed chances, the silence he had lived with. I thought about my mom, how strong she was, how full of life, always moving forward, always standing tall. I never imagined there had been someone quietly standing behind her, loving her from a distance, someone who had watched her build a life that didn't include him, and kept that heartbreak to himself all this time. Someone like Thomas. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my throat tightening with emotion. I wish I'd known. I wish I had known she was loved like that." He gave a small, bittersweet smile, like he had made peace with it, even if it still hurt. "There's not much to say, really. I didn't come here looking for anything. I just needed to get it off my chest. I've held it in for too long." He looked down, rubbing one hand over the other, as if unsure how much more to say. "Maybe it was selfish to keep this from you," he continued, "but I guess I figured it'd be easier that way. Easier to stay quiet. But the longer I waited, the harder it got. And now, well, I just didn't want to take it to my grave." I took a deep breath, feeling my emotions begin to settle. "I get it," I said, my voice steadier now. "I really do. And I want you to know, this doesn't change anything, Thomas. You're still my neighbor. You're still a part of my life. That's not going anywhere." He let out a slow breath, like he had been holding it in. His shoulders dropped just a bit, the tension in his posture easing. "I'm glad you feel that way," he said quietly. "I didn't want things to get weird between us, but I also didn't want to keep pretending this part of my life didn't exist." I stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, the streetlights cast a soft golden glow over the sidewalk in front yards. Everything looked calm, but inside, I was spinning. I needed a second to sort through the whirlwind of thoughts racing in my mind. The room felt a little heavier than before, like it now held something it hadn't just an hour ago. Something honest, something sacred. Then I heard his voice again, gentle, thoughtful. "You know, Claire, I've always admired you. You've got that same strength your mom had. That same independence. When I look at you, sometimes it feels like she's still here in some way." That stopped me cold. I turned around slowly to face him, surprised by how much I wanted to believe what he said. "You really think so?" I asked, my voice almost trembling. "Because I've always felt like I'm not much like her at all. I've tried, but after everything, it's hard to feel like I measure up." Thomas met my eyes, steady and kind. "Your mother was one of a kind, no doubt about that. But don't sell yourself short, Claire. You carry so much of her in the way you move through the world, in how you care for people, in how you stand on your own. I think she'd be proud of who you've become." Those words hit me in a way I didn't expect. Something warm surged in my chest, and suddenly my eyes burned with tears I hadn't realized were coming. It was like his words found a place inside me that still ached for her presence, for her voice, for some kind of sign that I hadn't messed everything up since she was gone. I felt the first tear slide down my cheek. "I didn't know I needed to hear that," I said, my voice breaking. "Thank you, Thomas." He smiled, Not wide, but soft and real. His eyes held a tenderness I hadn't seen before. It's the truth, Claire. You don't have to become her to honor her memory. You're already doing that just by living your life the way you do. We stood there in silence for a while. Not an awkward silence, but one of those quiet moments that wraps around you like a blanket. It was a pause full of understanding, of shared emotion, and the kind of peace that only comes after something honest has finally been said. Eventually, I broke the silence, speaking just above a whisper. I'm glad you told me all this, Thomas. I really am. And I think we're gonna be okay. This doesn't change our friendship. We've known each other too long for that. His expression softened even more, and he nodded slowly. You're right. We've been neighbors a long time. That won't change. I just feel better finally saying it out loud. I stepped closer to him, reached out, and placed my hand gently on his arm, just a simple gesture. But in that moment, it meant everything. That's something I've had to carry with me, Thomas said, his voice barely above a murmur, weighted with years of quiet sorrow. And the way he said it, it cut through me. I could feel the heaviness of it, like it had been resting on his shoulders for decades, and now, somehow, I was feeling it too. Not just hearing his regret, but almost wearing it. That kind of sadness has a way of reaching you, whether you're ready or not. My mind went to my mother. Strong, fearless, always moving forward like nothing could knock her down. It never once crossed my mind that someone had been silently standing behind her, watching, loving her from afar. Someone who had tucked his feelings deep inside and never said a word. Someone like Thomas, who was right here, sitting in my living room, telling me something I never imagined I'd hear. I don't even know what to say, I whispered, my voice cracking as I tried to push past the lump forming in my throat. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd known she meant that much to someone. Thomas gave me a quiet smile, the kind that shows on just one side of the face, the kind that hurts a little. There's nothing you need to say, he said gently. I didn't tell you because I wanted anything from you. I just needed to finally let it go. I've been holding on to it too long. He looked down at his hands, like he was unsure if the words had come out the right way. Maybe it was selfish, he continued. I figured silence was easier, for both of us, but as time passed, the silence started to feel heavier than the truth, and I realized I didn't want to leave this world still carrying it. I took a long breath, feeling a sense of calm creep in around the edges of everything I was feeling. I understand, I said this time with more strength in my voice. I really do. And Thomas, this doesn't change how I see you. You're still my neighbor. You've always been a part of my life. That doesn't disappear just because of this. He let out a breath, slow and deep, like he was finally letting go of something that had been stuck in his chest for years. I watched his posture soften. His shoulders dropped, his hands stopped fidgeting. I'm grateful to hear that, he said quietly. I was worried it might make things weird between us. But I also knew I couldn't pretend this part of my story didn't exist forever. I stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the street was still and calm, the streetlights casting that warm, honey-colored glow across the yard. Everything looked peaceful, but inside me, everything was moving. The air in the room felt different now, not heavy in a bad way, more like something sacred had just been shared, something that changed the shape of the space we were standing in. Then Thomas spoke again, softer this time. You know, Claire, I've always looked up to you. There's this quiet strength in you. Reminds me a lot of your mom. You've got that same fire in you, even when you don't notice it. Sometimes, when I see you out there, it feels like a piece of her is still around. I turned around, slowly, surprised by the emotion behind his words. Part of me wanted to believe him, really believe him. You really think that? I asked. My voice trembled a little, because I've always felt like I'm not enough like her. I don't know if I could ever live up to the woman she was, especially after losing her. It's been hard. Thomas looked at me with a kind of kindness I hadn't seen before. His eyes didn't just meet mine, they understood. She was incredible, no doubt about that, he said with a fondness in his voice. But you've got your own kind of strength. You might not see it, but it's there. It's in how you carry yourself, how you treat people. I think your mother would be proud, more than you realize. And those simple words, hit me like a wave. I felt something warm bloom in my chest, and before I could stop it, my eyes welled up. It was like he found a part of me that had gone untouched for years, a part that had been missing her voice, her presence, her guidance. A tear slipped down my cheek. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that, I whispered. Thank you, Thomas. He smiled, gentle, real, and there was a kindness in his eyes that I hadn't fully noticed before. It's just the truth, Claire, he said. You don't have to be exactly like her to carry her with you. You're already honoring her just by being who you are. We stood there, not saying anything, just letting the silence settle. But it was not the uncomfortable kind of silence. It was a silence that brought comfort, like the kind you share with someone who truly sees you. After a moment, I finally broke the quiet, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm glad you told me all of this. I really am, and I think we're going to be just fine. This doesn't change what we've got. We've known each other a long time. Thomas nodded slowly, his features softening even more. You're right. We have. And I feel lighter now. Just saying it. Just having it out there. I took a step closer and gently rested my hand on his arm. It was not a big gesture, but it meant something. And from the way he looked at me, I could tell he felt it too. Sometimes I just need a little space, I said, to let my thoughts settle and catch up with everything I'm feeling. Thomas didn't answer right away. He just looked at me with those soft, steady eyes, full of something that felt a lot like understanding. I know exactly what you mean, he said after a pause, his voice quiet, thoughtful. I've been doing a lot of that myself lately. Just thinking, trying to make sense of things. I waited, figuring he had more to say, but instead he came and sat down beside me. His posture was open, but there was still a cautious edge to it, like he wasn't quite sure where this moment might take us. The silence that followed wasn't tense, but it carried a weight, like something important was just beneath the surface, waiting to be said. Eventually he spoke again, his tone low and even. I've been thinking a lot about how I felt about your mom, and how I kept those feelings buried for so long. How I never got the chance to tell her the truth. I let all that time pass, thinking I'd get around to it. And I never did. I nodded slowly. You've been holding on to that for a long time, haven't you? His eyes drifted toward the horizon, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Too long. And the thing is, I've realized something, Claire. I've clung to those feelings so tightly that it started clouding everything else in my life. It's made it hard to see what's right in front of me. He paused, then looked back at me. I think it's finally time to let it go. I can't keep living back there, in the memories. It's time I stopped holding on to something that's already gone. There was a silence after that, one that felt different. Not heavy anymore, but calm. Like something inside him had eased up, like he had finally released the grip he had on a part of his past. You're right, I said quietly. You can't stay stuck back there. It's not fair, to you or anyone else. We all have to find a way to move forward, even if it's slow, even if it's just one step at a time. Thomas turned to look at me again, and this time his face looked lighter, more open. There was something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a kind of peace that was starting to take root. I think I've been scared to let go, he admitted. Scared that if I did, it'd be like losing her all over again. But hearing you say that, it makes me think maybe I don't have to carry it anymore. Maybe I'm finally allowed to set it down. I reached over and rested my hand gently on his arm. You are, Thomas. You're allowed to let go. It's okay to remember her, to care about your past. But you also deserve peace in the life you have now. You deserve to live in the present. He smiled then, a real smile, not forced or polite, but soft and genuine, and it reached all the way to his eyes. Thank you, Claire. You've done more for me than you probably know. And just like that, the air around us shifted. It felt lighter somehow, like the heaviness that had been hanging over both of us had finally started to lift. We sat there in silence, but this time it wasn't filled with uncertainty. It was full of quiet understanding, the kind that comes after two people finally speak their truth. After a few moments, I spoke again, my voice soft. I think we've both been holding on to things we didn't need to. But now, I think we're ready. Ready to move forward. Not with expectations, not with pressure. Just with honesty and peace. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. Yeah, he said almost to himself. That's exactly what I want. I'm ready for that. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the sounds of the day faded into the background, I felt something settle inside me. A stillness. For the first time in a while, I didn't feel like I was gripping the past so tightly. Instead, I felt open. Ready for whatever might come next. A new chapter, maybe. A fresh beginning. The days that followed that conversation brought a sense of lightness I hadn't expected. Thomas and I found a new rhythm, one that didn't look like what we had before. It was easier now, more open. We talked more freely, spent time together in ways that felt natural. No pressure, no awkwardness. Just two people who had shared something meaningful, learning how to enjoy each other's company again. The walls that had quietly stood between us for so long, they had come down, and in their place was something warmer, more comfortable, a gentle kind of companionship. There were still quiet moments, still times we would both reflect on all that had been uncovered. But that weight, that heaviness, it was gone. Then, one sunny afternoon, as I was out in the garden digging around the flower beds, I spotted Thomas walking over from next door. There was something different in his walk, something calmer. He looked more at ease than I had seen him in a long time. "Hey there," he said with a relaxed smile. "Hey, Thomas," I replied, brushing dirt off my hands as I set down my spade. "What's on your mind?" He stood there for a second, thoughtful, as if he was organizing his thoughts before letting them go. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, his voice softer than usual, "about everything we talked about, and about where we've both been, and where we might be going." I raised an eyebrow, sensing something deeper behind his tone. This wasn't just a casual chat. "So, what have you decided?" I asked. Thomas gave a small smile, though I could still see a hint of nerves in his eyes. "I think it's time I truly let go of the past," he said. "I've been clinging to old memories, old feelings, and regrets that I've carried way too long. But I'm ready now to live in the present, to appreciate the people in my life, and to make the most of what's still in front of me." Hearing that, something warm stirred inside me. His words felt honest, hard-earned. "That's a big step," I said gently, "but I think you're right. The past only holds power over us if we let it. We get to decide how much of it we carry forward." He nodded slowly, the truth of it sinking in. "Yeah," he said, "and I'm ready to move on. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but I do know I don't want to be stuck anymore." I reached out and placed my hand lightly on his arm. "You're not alone, Thomas. We all have our own stories, our own baggage to set down, but we also have a choice, how we move forward, what we leave behind." His eyes met mine, softer than I'd ever seen them. "I've come to realize something, Claire. The most important part of healing isn't changing the past. It's learning how to let it go, learning to make peace with where you are, not where you were." There was a quiet moment between us after that. Not awkward, not empty, just calm. Like we both understood what the other meant without having to explain it. In the weeks that followed, Thomas and I started spending more time together. Nothing dramatic, just small things. Sharing coffee on the porch, telling stories, laughing over the simple stuff. It was a shift. A slow, steady one. But it felt natural. The weight of the past didn't hang between us anymore. What we had now was something new. Something built on understanding and respect. Looking back, I started to realize how much I'd grown too. How much clarity had come out of everything we had shared. For so long, I'd been caught up in what had already happened. Fixated on old wounds, regrets, the stuff I couldn't change. And in doing that, I had overlooked the chances right in front of me. But now I was learning to let go of all that. And it felt good. Like breathing fresh air after being indoors too long. Thomas and I didn't say it out loud, but there was an unspoken agreement between us. We were moving forward. Without the old baggage, without the what-ifs weighing us down. Over time, I found myself becoming more open to change, more willing to let go of the things that no longer served me. Memories I used to hold onto too tightly, relationships that had run their course, even habits that kept me stuck. It was like I had finally given myself permission to live a little differently. One quiet evening, we were sitting on the porch again, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The sky was glowing with soft gold and pink, and the whole world felt still for a moment. Thomas turned to me, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know, Claire," he said, his voice low but sure, "I never thought I'd find peace again. Not after everything. But I think I found it here. With you. Talking with you. Learning from you. I didn't think I'd ever be able to let go. But now, I think I can." His words sank into me, warm and steady. "I think we've both found peace, in our own way," I said. "But you're right, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. And I think we're both finally on the right path." We sat in silence after that, just listening to the breeze and the soft sounds of the world winding down. It felt like the universe had slowed itself for a while, giving us space to reflect. And in that stillness, I knew something for sure. We had both changed. We weren't the same people we had been when this all began. And that was okay. In fact, it was exactly how it needed to be. As I looked at Thomas sitting beside me, I realized something else. Sometimes the moments that shake us, that make us question everything, those are the very moments that lead us to the most unexpected growth. That night, when he had opened his heart to me, it had started something neither of us saw coming. And it had changed us both. We hadn't figured it all out yet. We weren't at the end of anything. But we weren't stuck anymore either. And that made all the difference. That was when I finally understood. Sometimes the most meaningful moments in life don't come with fireworks or big announcements. They come in the quiet spaces, in the conversations that linger, in the comfort of someone choosing to sit beside you. For the first time in a long while, I felt ready, really ready, to embrace whatever came next.